She held a secret that could destroy everything. Welcome to Inspector Morse. I'm your host, Hawthorne. Share your thoughts in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. Now, the forbidden truth is about to unfold. The morning arrived like a half-forgotten memory, pale and reluctant, the mist curling around the spires of Oxford as though the city itself were holding its breath. I stood at the threshold of my flat, lukewarm coffee in hand, the porcelain cup a little too light, a little too fragile for the weight of thought pressing upon me. The Isis flowed quietly, brown and reflective beneath punted oars, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of some unseen fish. I sipped, noting the chill in my fingertips, the faint tang of rain on stone, and the echo of some line of poetry I could not quite place, perhaps Wordsworth or someone equally mournful, a meditation on silence, absence, and the slow erosion of certainty. On the doorstep, neatly folded, lay a newspaper clipping, its edges crisp against the damp concrete. I picked it up with a careful hand, aware of the faint smell of ink and newsprint, that transient perfume of information that is already becoming history. Sister Beatrice of St. Hilda's convent had died, it said, under what the obituarist delicately termed mysterious circumstances. No photograph, no flourish, only a line or two of words that seemed almost designed to evade understanding, rather than provide it. I held the clipping between thumb and forefinger, and felt the peculiarly sharp pang of curiosity that always accompanies such omissions. I wandered slowly toward the bridge over the Isis, letting my eyes rest on the dreaming colleges, their stone facades darkened by overnight rain, the windows glinting faintly in the mist. I thought of cloisters, of hushed corridors and the scent of old wood and incense, and felt the peculiar intimacy of places where life is deliberately confined. I remembered the faint rhythm of a nun's chant, years before, echoing through some chapel I had visited on a whim, and the peculiar calm that follows when sound is both presence and absence at once. A thought flickered, sudden and minute, as I unfolded the clipping fully. The phrasing, curt and almost evasive, suggested a discretion born of habit, or perhaps fear, perhaps both. I considered the ordinary absurdities that often camouflage extraordinary truths, as a minor puzzle piece might be deliberately obscured to test patience. There was a crossword in that morning's paper, left open on the kitchen table. The clue temptation undone by a vow seemed to hang in the air, absurdly precise, teasing at some connection I did not yet see. I sipped again, letting the coffee stain the back of my throat, bitter but consoling in its constancy. My gaze wandered to the empty punts, the fog-laden trees along the bank, the solitary figure of a man bending over some forgotten task, and I allowed myself the faint irony that, in a city of centuries-old learning, even death could be discreetly buried in a few terse words. The world outside remained quietly opaque, a veil of expectation and suggestion, and I felt, in a way I had come to know too well, the gentle, insistent tug of questions without answers. As I pocketed the clipping, the weight of it seemed already to pulse with latent purpose, a quiet summons to curiosity, patience, and the deliberate uncovering of human complexity. I thought, fleetingly, of the nuns' cloistered lives, their restrained gestures, the hidden currents of loyalty and pride. Perhaps some truth lingered in that silence, or in the subtle dissonance of a glance, the misplacement of a rosary bead, or a line of poetry remembered imperfectly. I felt, as I always do at the outset, that there is solace and melancholy in the slow pursuit of understanding, in the knowledge that the city and its inhabitants will not be hurried, and that even in grief there is the quiet poetry of observation. The mist thickened. I turned back toward my flat, leaving the river to its muted reflections, and carried the clipping as one might carry a small, fragile confession. Somewhere in Oxford, I thought, the story was beginning, and it would not unfold with haste. We arrived at St. Hilda's under a sky thick with grey, the rain soft enough to blur the sharp edges of the convent stonework, yet insistent in its dampness, tracing the outlines of windows like wet ink. Lewis muttered something about the weather, though I could not recall precisely. His voice always seemed to occupy a half space between observation and habit. The convent rose before us austere and deliberate, its walls a quiet admonishment, as if the very stones insisted upon discretion. The air smelled of wet stone, faint incense, and something older, like pages in a library that had been turned 1,000 times yet never read fully. Mother Superior received us in the entrance hall. She was tall, impeccably composed, her posture unyielding, yet her eyes hinted at knowledge she considered delicate, almost dangerous. She spoke of Sister Beatrice with courteous restraint, her phrasing careful, clipped, and oddly rehearsed. I noted a small tremor, the slightest hesitation, when she mentioned the nun's last hours. It was a gesture easily overlooked, but not by someone who habitually watches for what lies beneath. Lewis, ever straightforward, remarked on the unexpected nature of the death. Mother Superior nodded, but her reply seemed to float above the conversation, a polite echo rather than engagement. I unfolded that morning's paper again as we moved through the cloisters, letting the crosswords spread open in my mind. Temptation undone by a vow, it read. The words insisted upon themselves, teasing the boundary between metaphor and reality, and I felt a subtle pulse of recognition. There was, perhaps, a clue in Sister Beatrice's devotion, or in the fissure between piety and desire, and the phrase lodged quietly in my thought like a half-heard chant. The corridors were faintly damp, the floorboards groaning under our measured steps. Candles flickered along the walls, their flames reflected in polished surfaces, casting shadows that suggested movement even when there was none. Each door, each panel seemed to guard a secret, the air heavy with the absence of the nun herself. I could sense, without reasoning fully, that something had been removed, not violently, but deliberately. Personal effects, small and intimate, were absent from her room. The missing objects whispered more than their presence ever could. The nuns we encountered were restrained in speech, measured in gesture, their intellects evident in the careful modulation of tone, yet something in the cadence of their phrases seemed rehearsed. A pause, a lowered glance, a hand brushing a sleeve too deliberately. These were the tiny fissures through which truth might seep. One of them mentioned a guest who had called, almost as an afterthought. The name struck no immediate alarm, but the manner of its delivery lodged in my mind, as though promising significance in time. Lewis noted a faint trace of incense lingering in corners, a detail I might have missed in the subtle layering of smells, but it seemed to underscore the deliberate ritualization of every aspect of this place. I thought of the library upstairs, the scent of old bindings and damp parchment, the promise that knowledge, like devotion, can be withheld or distorted. The convent existed in an almost absolute silence, yet it spoke, in glances, in omissions, in the deliberate shaping of experience. I carried the crossword clue with me as a quiet companion, turning it over against the shadows of the cloisters and the measured words of Mother Superior. Each step along the damp corridor felt like a negotiation with the past, and I began to perceive, just barely, the outline of a subtle pattern, the inconsistencies, the absences, the cadence of speech. None of it revealed a murderer, yet each detail hummed with the potential of revelation. Outside, the rain softened to mist. I paused briefly at the entrance, letting the damp chill seep through my coat, and realized that in the convent's quiet there was already a story unfolding, one that required patience, observation, and the unhurried accumulation of truths that no one was yet ready to speak aloud. I remember entering Sister Beatrice's room with the quiet trepidation one reserves for spaces already shaped by absence. The air was faintly perfumed with candle wax and dust, the bed neatly made as though its occupant might return at any moment, and yet a stillness lingered that was almost palpable, like a pause between notes in a long-forgotten hymn. A diary lay upon the desk, its leather binding unmarked by time, untouched except for the faint impressions of handwriting on its pages. I opened it carefully, noting that one page had been removed, leaving behind the faint ghost of paper fibres, a silence in the sequence where a thought should have resided. Lewis, in his habitual fashion, inspected the mundane, pointing out the half-drunk cup of tea by the window, its surface already cold, and the hotel register tucked beneath a corner of the desk. A visitor had signed in 3 days before, arriving unannounced, then departing with little trace beyond the penmanship in that thin book. The details seemed almost banal, yet in a case such as this, the ordinary often conceals the extraordinary, and I made a mental note to return to them. I turned my attention to a Bible resting on the nightstand, the leather cover worn and soft under my fingers. Between its pages, an inscription in Latin caught my eye, penned in a hand careful but hurried, the script curling at the margins. Non omnia possumus omnes. Not all things are possible for everyone. I repeated it under my breath, savouring the cadence, the subtle interplay between humility and warning. The placement seemed deliberate, almost a coded premonition, a quiet message meant to be deciphered by someone patient enough to linger in small details. The missing diary page, the inscription, the visitor's fleeting presence, they formed a constellation of hints that flickered in the periphery of understanding, too delicate to grasp fully yet insistent enough to demand attention. I traced my finger along the edge of the desk, noting a faint indentation, perhaps from a letter long removed, and a shadow of memory surfaced, a line of Wordsworth, misquoted in the nun's hand, promising that in nature's silence one might hear truths otherwise concealed. The juxtaposition of devotion and secrecy seemed almost cruel, a whisper of human frailty enfolded in ritual and restraint. Lewis murmured something about the arrangement of furniture, the careful spacing of books, as though the room itself conspired to be unobtrusive, yet he did not notice the rhythm of absence that pulled at the margins of observation. I felt, as I often do, the patient accumulation of minor discrepancies, gestures too small for ordinary perception, yet collectively forming the architecture of insight. I paused by the window, looking down at the courtyard damp with early morning mist, and felt the peculiar ache of anticipation. The room was a testament to order and discipline, yet beneath that discipline simmered evidence of concealment, of thoughts too dangerous or delicate to be recorded in full. Even the scent of incense seemed measured, deliberate, perhaps masking or preserving memory. A slight tilt of the diary, a faint scratch in the desk, the careful positioning of a teacup, each minor detail shimmered with potential meaning. I allowed myself to linger there, letting the quiet insinuate itself into thought, sensing that the story of Sister Beatrice's last days was written in absences, in shadows, and in gestures that the unobservant would never perceive. The page had been removed, yet its removal spoke louder than any line could, and in that silence I understood that the first layer of truth always arrives obliquely, inscribed in absence, and that what is left behind may be more eloquent than what is preserved. I recall the slow procession through the convent's halls, each corridor a measured cadence of polished wood and whispered footsteps, the scent of old paper and faint incense settling into memory. The nuns gathered with quiet restraint, their hands folded or busy with delicate tasks, eyes shifting in ways that suggested attentiveness and caution in equal measure. Lewis asked simple questions, and the answers arrived as if through a filter of propriety, each carefully modulated, courteous, yet evasive. I listened, not for what was said, but for what wavered beneath the surface. There was Sister Agnes, whose love for music seemed trapped in the lungs of her body, a melody that refused to escape. Her fingers tapped unconsciously against the arm of a chair, a rhythm half heard, almost apologetic, and I noted the slight wince when we mentioned Sister Beatrice's devotion to the convent choir. Sister Agnes's phrasing was deliberate, punctuated with small pauses, each pause echoing a possible concealment. Then Sister Marianne, whose past appeared to have been carefully archived in secrecy. She smiled politely when I inquired about Sister Beatrice's last days, yet the warmth did not reach her eyes. A delicate scar at the wrist, almost invisible, caught the light, a faint clue that seemed to belong to another story entirely. Her words lingered on the edge of confession, never fully crossing, yet suggestive of attachments that the convent had neither sanctioned nor entirely extinguished. Sister Lillian was devoted, rigid in routine, yet there was a chill in her measured gestures, a misalignment of rosary beads that betrayed a nervous precision. Her eyes, dark and observant, lingered on corners of the room that no one else attended, and I wondered what she catalogued in that hidden space. Each motion was precise, her devotion intact, yet I could not shake the impression that her care concealed something less accessible, something tightly bound. As they spoke, the subtle irregularities in phrasing, in hesitation, in the pressure of hands on knotted chords, began to form a pattern, a rhythm that was at once ordinary and telling, a word slightly elongated, a nod that arrived a fraction too late, a glance that skirted the question. These were whispers of truth, subtle gestures that accumulated meaning only if one paused long enough to notice them. Lewis, ever more literal, remarked on the regularity of their duties, the absence of dramatic friction, yet I sensed undercurrents of rivalry, affection, and careful concealment. The convent operated with a harmony that seemed absolute, yet, like a musical composition, there were rests and pauses, moments deliberately placed to suggest innocence, but pregnant with ambiguity. I allowed myself the luxury of observation without interruption, letting the room breathe, registering the quiet dissonances. A small vase tilted just enough to catch the light, a shadow along the corridor where none should have fallen, the almost imperceptible hesitation before a reply. All of it fed the slow construction of motive and character. Each nun seemed innocent, yet the layers beneath their civility glimmered, fragile and complex, as if the secrets of the convent were woven into the rhythm of daily life itself. By the time we departed the room, I carried a sense of balance between the apparent and the hidden, a measure of each character held in quiet suspicion. I knew, as one always does at this stage, that understanding would come not from confession but from accumulation, the tiniest gesture, a misquoted line of scripture, the texture of absence and the weight of what is left unsaid. And in that silence the convent remained its own universe, each inhabitant a note in a chord that, when struck, might yet resonate with truths we had only begun to perceive. That evening the convent assumed a quiet I had not expected, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the day's careful exchanges and now held them in suspense. I walked the garden paths with Lewis trailing behind, the grass slick with mist and the scent of wet stone mingling with the faint, lingering perfume of lilies from the chapel. The fading light transformed hedges into vague, ambiguous shapes, shadows that might have concealed gestures or whispered confidences. I allowed the stillness to settle around me, feeling how secrets often reside not in words but in what remains unsaid. A conversation drifted from an upper window, fragments of voices threaded with hesitation. One nun spoke of Sister Beatrice's diligence, another murmured something that hinted at unrecorded grievances, and the pauses between words seemed to bear the weight of recollection and guilt. Lewis noted the exchange with a glance, but it was the silences that struck me, the small tremors in speech that suggested memories neither fully owned nor entirely forgiven. I felt, as I often do, that the truth hides in these subtle inflections, in the cadence of hesitation rather than the declaration of fact. I remembered the coded poem Sister Beatrice had once read aloud during Vespers, its rhythm now pressing insistently against the edges of my consciousness. Each line, once lyrical, seemed loaded with meaning I had only begun to decipher. The careful repetition of certain vowels, the placement of words in relation to the stanza, a punctuation mark that appeared arbitrary but was anything but. There is a certain cruelty in such subtlety, a whisper of knowledge that can be shared only with those who look long and attentively. A red herring emerged during our conversation with one of the visiting scholars. His grievance with Sister Beatrice over an academic misjudgment seemed almost convincing, the frustration in his tone lending gravity to his presence. I filed it away, noting the precise way he avoided the eyes of the nuns, the careful modulation of his speech. There was satisfaction in the plausibility of his motives, and yet, as with so many things, plausibility and truth rarely coincide. We returned to the corridor, damp and faintly echoing with footsteps that belonged to no one, and I noticed a minor detail. A small piece of embroidery shifted on a chair, its pattern misaligned with care that suggested nervous hands rather than accident. It was absurd, yet somehow suggestive, a minor friction against the surface of perfection that demanded notice. I could almost hear the unspoken story it traced, a hint that human error or intention often leaves traces, however delicate. Lewis remarked on the quiet order of the convent, and I allowed the observation to drift past, sensing the tension that lurked beneath civility. There was no outburst, no dramatic confession, only the steady pulse of routine, each gesture layered with history, pride, and avoidance. The nuns' faces, calm yet attentive, suggested loyalty tempered with something unspoken, a measure of secrecy held in the arch of a brow, the tilt of a head, the slight tension of a hand upon a book. As twilight deepened, I lingered on the threshold of a window, feeling the night's chill seep into my coat and the faint ache of anticipation for what might surface next. The convent breathed around me, an organism of discipline and hidden currents, and I realized that the story of Sister Beatrice's last days would not be revealed through confrontation, but through patient accumulation of the small, flickering signs she had left behind. And in that patience there was a quiet promise, a revelation, subtle and certain, awaiting those who would notice what others overlooked. I remember walking along the rain-slicked streets of Oxford toward the little wine shop tucked between a college and a row of shuttered bookshops. The air was heavy with damp, the smell of wet stone mingling with the faint tang of fermentation from some nearby tavern, and I allowed myself the slow absorption of detail, the pleasure of observation unhurried. Lewis, as ever, noted the obvious, the neat window displays, the brass handle dulled with use. I, however, was already attuned to the subtler signals, the way the shop's proprietor glanced toward the door before speaking, the manner in which the bottles were arranged, the slightly askew label on a rare vintage that might have been handled more recently than care suggested. Inside, the smell of oak casks and rich fruit enveloped us, a comforting warmth in contrast to the mist outside. The proprietor greeted us with cautious politeness, noting that Sister Beatrice had been a frequent visitor, her taste particular, her questions always careful. I listened, allowing the rhythm of his speech to settle around me, noting the subtle inflections, the half-pauses that suggested there was more beneath the surface than mere commerce. He mentioned a meeting she had had there, a quiet appointment with someone who had seemed anxious, almost furtive. The details were thin, the significance hovering at the edge of comprehension, yet I sensed a latent meaning in the way he lingered over her name. Lewis remarked on the neatness of the shelves and the regularity of the customer's habits, but my attention had already shifted to the label of a rare wine, a delicate pattern slightly offset, a tiny fingerprint smudging the seal. Such a minor imperfection might have been insignificant to anyone else, yet in a place of meticulous order it spoke of human presence and possibly intention. I noted it quietly, aware that it might align with a later observation, the faint trace of someone passing, someone remembered but unseen. The conversation drifted towards Sister Beatrice's acquaintances, the people she had met outside the convent. One name recurred almost casually, a visiting scholar whose temperament I had already catalogued as prickly and precise. His presence in the wine shop, his subtle avoidance of the proprietor's gaze, the careful modulation of his words, each element suggested an anxiety, a concealed motive, or perhaps simply pride masquerading as guilt. I filed these impressions alongside the minor clues already gathered, the missing diary page, the Latin inscription, the silent gestures of the nuns. Outside, the rain had softened to a mist that clung to my coat, the street lamps glowing in halos, refracted by damp glass. I walked slowly, replaying the minutiae of the visit, the subtle whispers in tone and gesture, the way minor imperfections betray care, and care often conceals desire. Lewis was silent, satisfied with the surface, and I allowed him that, recognizing that not all attention need be shared to be effective. There is a peculiar satisfaction in the accumulation of small signals, a rhythm to the unhurried collection of human error and subtle communication. Each visit, each observation becomes a stanza in a larger poem, its meaning not immediate but emerging gradually, like a melody half heard in a distant chapel. I sensed that the scholar, the wine shop, even the arrangement of bottles were pieces in a quiet puzzle, one that demanded patience, reflection, and the careful passing of gestures too slight for ordinary notice. By the time we departed, Oxford had settled into evening. Mist hung over the river, reflections soft and ambiguous. I pocketed the minor details, the smudged label, the anxious glance, the careful phrases, as one might collect fragments of music, letting them resonate in memory. In the quiet accumulation of evidence, there was a sense that the story was coalescing, though still refracted through shadows, waiting for the patient mind to translate subtlety into insight. The opera house stood in muted grandeur, its stone facade damp, with mist, the scent of rain clinging to carved reliefs like memory. I arrived early, Lewis trailing with his habitual mixture of curiosity and impatience. Inside, the hall was hushed, the air redolent of varnish, aged wood, and the faint metallic tang of chandeliers. The seats were empty, yet the silence seemed to vibrate with unspoken narratives, each echo a whisper of anticipation and regret. I could feel the weight of absence, the deliberate shaping of attention, the way space itself can dictate the rhythm of observation. I unfolded Sister Beatrice's letters again, letting the inked lines guide my eye across the page. Each word, carefully chosen, suggested devotion and intellect intertwined, yet there were slips, a misaligned phrase, an awkward verb tense that hinted at anxiety or concealment. I lingered over a single line misquoting Shelley, the error subtle enough to pass unnoticed by anyone less attuned, yet it pulsed with significance when framed by her devotion and the coded poem I had already begun to decode. Words meant for confession, perhaps, or for someone attuned enough to understand the rhythm beneath the syntax. Lewis remarked on the grandeur of the recital hall, noting the symmetry and the polish of the instruments, but my attention was elsewhere. I observed the placement of the music stands, the slight misalignment of a chair in the corner, the faint impression of footsteps in the dust near the entrance, gestures of human presence recorded by inanimate objects. Such minutiae often speak louder than statements or confessions, especially in a world where decorum conceals emotion and knowledge alike. The choir arrived soon after, their movements deliberate, rehearsed, yet uneven in the subtlest ways. One nun, perhaps Sister Agnes, hesitated before taking her place, a tremor in her hand as she adjusted her sheet music, her eyes briefly flicking toward the empty seat where Sister Beatrice should have stood. The gesture was fleeting, easily missed, yet it registered as a fissure in an otherwise polished performance. In a place devoted to perfection, even a half-beat of uncertainty can reveal more than pages of testimony. I traced my gaze along the audience, imagining the convent's hidden observers, the silent witnesses to devotion, secrecy, and subtle transgression. In the folding of hands, in the tilt of a head, in the careful modulation of breath, there exists a language nearly invisible, and I was patient enough to read it. The opera, in all its quiet drama, became a mirror of the convent, ritual, order, artistry, and yet beneath it, human complexity, private anxieties, and concealed emotion. Lewis found humour in the rigid routine, in the way the nuns adjusted their robes or straightened the music stands, but I felt the rhythm of hidden narrative, the cadence of tension that neither he nor the performers fully acknowledged. Every small misalignment, a chair, a breath, a glance, seemed to align with fragments I had gathered elsewhere, the missing diary page, the coded poem, the smudged label at the wine shop. Patterns began to emerge, tenuous yet insistent, as if the faintest vibration could eventually resolve into melody. By the time the choir's rehearsal concluded, the hall was emptied of sound but not of resonance. I walked slowly through the aisles, letting the polished wood and the lingering scents record themselves in memory. Each echo, each minor dissonance, became part of a quietly insistent truth. The opera of silence, I thought, had revealed more than any spoken confession, and in that revelation, fragile and partial, I sensed the contours of a mystery still unbroken, yet awaiting careful, patient interpretation. The afternoon arrived pale and diffident, the sky a muted wash of grey over Oxford's familiar spires. Lewis and I had returned to St. Hilda's, the damp lingering on our coats and in the soles of our shoes. The convent seemed unchanged, yet the atmosphere carried a subtle shift, like the faint vibration before a chord resolves. It was in that quiet tension that an unexpected visitor appeared, a man, unremarkable at first glance, yet possessing a presence that suggested careful control. He claimed a prior acquaintance with Sister Beatrice, though the precision of his phrasing, the careful avoidance of pronouns, betrayed a practiced discretion. Mother Superior allowed him entrance with a courteous, almost hesitant nod, and I noticed immediately the micro-gestures in her posture, a tightening of fingers along the edge of a sleeve, a fractional shift of weight, a glance briefly meeting his before being diverted. These small signs, often invisible to casual observation, suggested a shared history, the edges of which remained obscured. The visitor spoke of his association with Sister Beatrice's charitable work, of scholarly pursuits she had undertaken quietly, and of conversations that lingered in memory rather than record. Lewis, ever literal, recorded the names and dates. I traced the pauses, the inflection in his voice, the half-smile that seemed to hold something unspoken. I recalled the crossword from that morning, temptation undone by a vow, and allowed it to percolate in my mind. The visitor's careful diction, the meticulous avoidance of certain topics, seemed to interact with that clue in ways I could not yet articulate, as though the puzzle and the conversation were operating on parallel tracks, destined to intersect later in revelation. There was a subtle rhythm to his words, a tension between honesty and concealment that demanded attention. We moved through the cloisters together, the visitor lingering near the corridors where the nuns passed in quiet procession. His eyes occasionally flicked to doorways, as if memorizing details, and I noted a slight stiffness in his gait, the faintest hesitation before each turn. He gestured toward the garden, remarking on its early blooms, and I noticed how his observations, while superficially innocent, revealed careful scanning, a consciousness of movement and space that hinted at intent. Lewis mentioned the ordinary logistics, Sister Beatrice's appointments, her regular visits to the wine shop, the way she favoured certain paths through the city. I noted the visitor's micro-reactions, the subtle tightening around his eyes when these details were enumerated, as though a memory had stirred, a line of poetry recalled, or a fact inadvertently revealed. There was a quiet, almost imperceptible dissonance, like a note slightly flat in an otherwise harmonious chord. As he departed, Mother Superior's expression lingered on the threshold longer than courtesy required, a silent calculus of trust and recollection. The visitor left us with no overt disclosure, yet the impression remained, a presence that altered the rhythm of the convent, that intersected with hidden narratives and minor inconsistencies previously noted. Even in his absence, he seemed to linger in the corridors, in the polished wood, in the careful alignment of rosary beads, and in the half-remembered lines of Sister Beatrice's letters. I stood by the cloister's edge, watching the mist curl along the garden paths, aware that each new arrival introduces possibilities as well as complications. The subtle interplay of presence and absence, of gesture and evasion, had begun to layer upon the earlier clues, creating a faint but discernible pattern, and in that pattern, partial and delicate, I sensed the faint pulse of insight. Still, the library at St. Hilda's was a sanctuary of shadow and smell, aged paper, polished oak, and the faint trace of candle wax lingering in corners. I arrived early, the air still cool and damp from the morning mist, and allowed myself to absorb the muted rhythm of the room before Lewis followed. Shelves rose like silent sentinels, and the dust motes drifted in the streams of light slicing through high windows, each particle a tiny, suspended moment of memory. It was here, among the quiet order of books, that absences and traces reveal themselves in ways a bustling world conceals. I traced my fingers along the spines, noting the slight irregularity where a volume had been replaced incorrectly. A single book, a volume of medieval theology, seemed to bear a faint indentation on its cover, as if something had been removed hurriedly and yet with care. I pulled it free, and tucked within was a slip of parchment, the missing diary page, folded meticulously, the handwriting unmistakably Sister Beatrice's. The words were careful yet laden with implication, a meditation on vows, desire, and the tension between duty and secrecy. I read it twice, slowly, allowing each line to settle, the rhythm of the sentences resonating like a quiet confession. Lewis, as he often does, focused on the obvious, the arrangement of tables, the neatness of chairs, the absence of outward disturbance. Yet it was in the smallest details. A misaligned ink blot, a slightly curled corner, the faint smell of tea absorbed into paper, that meaning whispered. The page had been removed and replaced in such a manner as to suggest neither panic nor negligence, but deliberate concealment, the act itself almost ceremonial in precision. I recalled the visitor from the afternoon, the careful modulation of his voice, the half-smile that suggested both remembrance and concealment. The diary page seemed to intersect with his presence, the subtle patterns in phrasing echoing moments from our earlier conversation. A phrase misquoted from Wordsworth, a line deliberately underlined, a margin left intentionally blank, each element a fragment of communication designed to be interpreted only by a perceptive observer. There was also a faint smell of incense in the stacks, a reminder of the convent's ritual, overlaid now with the subtler scent of damp paper and ink. I noted, too, the subtle wear in the aisle carpets, the faint scuffing near one corner, suggesting repeated passage, a path traced with intention rather than accident. In the quiet accumulation of such details, the narrative began to flicker into partial coherence. The missing page, the visitor, the subtle gestures of the nuns, and even the misaligned rosary bead that had first caught my attention in Chapter 4. Lewis remarked on the serenity of the space, noting that it was hard to imagine mischief in such an ordered room. I allowed the observation to drift past, recognizing that order is often the perfect disguise for disruption, and that truth, in spaces of discipline, reveals itself only in small inconsistencies. The shadows along the shelves, the slight hesitation before a step, the faintly displaced parchment, each of these, trivial alone, together formed a fragile but persistent pattern. As I closed the volume and replaced it carefully, I felt the first real pulse of insight, fragile and tentative. The missing diary page, restored and examined, had begun to dissolve the veil of ambiguity, highlighting the subtle interplay between devotion and desire, secrecy and disclosure. In the quiet library, among shadows and scents and the measured rhythm of dust motes, the story of Sister Beatrice's final days began to take a faint but discernible shape, a structure of motives and omissions, of gestures and absences, ready for careful, patient elucidation. Scant, yet unmistakably present. The convent was unusually silent that night, the corridors deep with shadow, the faint scent of wet stone and lingering incense pressing into memory. I had returned alone, the lamps casting pools of amber on polished floors, each step echoing with careful restraint. Lewis had retired to the inn, citing fatigue and a desire for whiskey, but I felt compelled to linger, drawn by the subtle energy that often precedes revelation. There is a peculiar quality to late-night observation. The world slows, gestures sharpen, and even the faintest shift in posture or expression acquires significance. I was lingering near Sister Beatrice's room when a soft knock echoed along the corridor. The visitor, unexpected yet familiar from the afternoon, stepped quietly inside, as though the convent itself had granted him permission. He carried no luggage, offered no greeting beyond the careful arrangement of words, and his presence seemed to fold the shadows around him into taut attention. I noted immediately the precision of his movements, the slight tension in his hands, the meticulous manner in which he surveyed the room. It was a choreography of discretion, honed perhaps by years of careful concealment. He spoke in measured tones, recounting a recent correspondence with Sister Beatrice, hinting at confidences shared and unresolved questions. Lewis would have recorded the factual content, but I attended to subtleties, the way certain words lingered longer than necessary, the inflection in moments of supposed casual recollection, the slight hesitation that preceded each assertion. I felt the faint rhythm of tension beneath civility, the pulse of anxiety that rarely rises to the surface but always resonates when one knows where to listen. A subtle clue caught my attention, a book on the table, its spine nudged slightly forward, the page number bookmarked with a folded corner. I recognized the pattern from earlier observations, a trace of deliberate reference, perhaps left intentionally for someone patient enough to perceive it. The visitor's eyes lingered on the same page, almost imperceptibly, and I sensed the silent exchange, the alignment of intention, the careful dance between disclosure and concealment. He mentioned an encounter at the wine shop, a casual reference that could have been brushed aside, yet the phrasing was slightly off, a nuanced misalignment that suggested omission rather than error. I noted it quietly, filing it alongside the diary page, the coded poem, and the minor inconsistencies in the nun's behaviours. Each element began to align, forming a lattice of partial truths and hidden motives, glimpsed in fragments, to be pieced together with patience and care. The visitor departed as quietly as he had arrived, leaving the room settled in its usual order, yet charged with residual tension. I lingered a moment, tracing the subtle disturbances, the displaced book, the faint indentation of a chair, the echo of a nearly silent footfall. In these minor perturbations, the narrative began to crystallize, revealing the faint contours of intrigue and devotion entwined, secrecy entwined with affection, and perhaps guilt. As I finally left the corridor, the convent seemed to exhale, the shadows folding back into stillness. I sensed that the night had shifted, that small, almost imperceptible confessions had been rendered through gestures rather than words, through presence rather than speech. The story of Sister Beatrice's last days had grown more coherent, yet still remained a delicate lattice of absence and revelation, waiting for the final connections that only careful observation and time would bring. The morning was pale, Oxford drenched in the soft melancholy of drizzle that blurred the edges of familiar spires. Lewis and I returned to St. Hilda's with a sense of quiet urgency, the previous night's observations still pressing against memory. There is a peculiar clarity that emerges after a period of attentive waiting, when disparate elements begin to align as though the world itself conspired to reveal its secrets. I felt that subtle shift as I approached the cloisters, the damp stones gleaming under the soft light, the air saturated with the faint perfume of wet foliage and lingering incense. I revisited Sister Beatrice's diary, the missing page now restored, and allowed the coded poem to unfold again beneath my gaze. Its repetition of certain vowels, the subtle patterning of line breaks, and the deliberate underlining of specific words struck me differently this morning. A connection crystallized. The poem's rhythm mirrored the arrangement of letters in the visitor's name, as he had written it in correspondence. It was an almost imperceptible cipher, elegant and precise, the kind that demands patience and an appreciation for nuance. Lewis remarked on the mundane logistics, the timing of the visitor's arrival, the schedule of the nuns, the routine appointments, and I allowed the observations to settle beside the more subtle elements. Patterns often emerge at the intersection of routine and anomaly, and I felt the faint thrill of recognition as the lattice work of the case began to resolve. The visitor's presence, the missing diary page, and the coded poem were no longer disparate threads. They intertwined in a quiet, almost literary elegance. I traced the visitor's movements, mentally reconstructing the sequence of gestures, glances, and pauses. His precise diction, the faint tension in his hands, the almost imperceptible hesitation when mentioning the wine shop. Each acted as a subtle fingerprint upon the narrative. There is a rhythm to human behavior, a cadence that is difficult to obscure entirely, even when conscious effort is made. The revelation emerged not as a single strike of clarity, but as the accumulation of these quiet signals, a mosaic of intention and omission. In the library, I noticed once again the slight misalignment of the ink blot on the diary page, its deliberate irregularity resonating with the coded message. The act of concealment, performed with such care, betrayed as much as it protected. A single misaligned rosary bead, a half-curled page, the faint echo of footsteps along the corridor. Each seemed trivial alone, yet in the emerging pattern they glimmered with meaning. Lewis, observing my quiet absorption, remarked that it seemed almost literary, and I allowed a brief smile at the aptness of the word. By mid-morning, I felt the first coherent pulse of understanding. The interplay of devotion and secrecy, affection and discretion, had become discernible through the prism of careful observation. Sister Beatrice's final days were no longer a sequence of isolated gestures and absent pages. They were a narrative carefully constructed, a lattice of clues and half-confessions, revealed only to those willing to notice the faintest inflections of intent. We left the library with a sense of measured anticipation, the drizzle softening to mist along the garden paths. I allowed myself the quiet satisfaction that comes with the first tangible connection in a delicate puzzle. The visitor, the diary, the coded poem. Each was no longer merely an isolated element, but part of a harmonized structure, a revelation waiting for the final key to translate its subtlety into clarity. In that morning light, Oxford seemed both familiar and newly inscrutable, the promise of resolution mingling with the quiet ache of observation and patience. Twilight fell over Oxford like a muted sigh, the city's spires blurring into the indigo of approaching night. The damp stone of the convent corridors absorbed the last fragments of daylight, leaving a subdued, almost conspiratorial atmosphere. Lewis and I moved quietly through the cloisters, aware that our presence had altered the rhythm of the nuns' routine. There is a subtle energy to such hours, a heightened attention to gesture, posture, and inflection, when the ordinary becomes charged with the possibility of revelation. Mother Superior received us in the common room, her expression composed yet edged with apprehension. She offered tea with careful politeness, but her hands betrayed slight tension in the way fingers lingered along the rim of the cup. I noted the minor discrepancies in her phrasing, the faint hesitations that suggested she measured her words against some unseen standard. Conversation drifted toward Sister Beatrice, her habits, her final days, and her interactions with the visitor. Each response, each fragment of recollection, became a lens through which the subtle undercurrents of the convent revealed themselves. I questioned the nuns individually, observing the small fissures in composure. One spoke of her love for music, but hesitated when recounting her last practice with Beatrice, her eyes flicking away with the precision of someone guarding memory. Another, devoted yet cool, recited events in meticulous detail, but failed to align the emotional cadence with the facts, a misalignment that hinted at concealment. The visitor's name arose and reactions varied, a slight blanching, a fleeting shift in posture, a word almost swallowed before articulation. These micro-reactions, like scattered notes in a composition, suggested motives and loyalties that were otherwise unspoken. Lewis, ever literal, catalogued names, dates, and appointments, but I allowed myself to dwell on subtleties. A rosary bead misaligned, a crease in a letter, the faint impression of fingerprints on a table. Such minor irregularities often reveal far more than direct statements, for human behavior leaves traces even when the mouth speaks cautiously. The intersection of these details with the missing diary page and the coded poem illuminated patterns that were previously only half glimpsed, a lattice of intent faintly etched into everyday movements. I confronted one of the nuns with a minor inconsistency, phrasing it as an observation rather than accusation. The effect was immediate, a subtle tightening around the eyes, a tremor in the hand resting upon her prayer book. The silent admission, conveyed entirely through gesture, confirmed what words might have concealed. In these twilight hours, revelation often arrives not with the drama of confession but with the quiet tremor of unguarded instinct. By the time we left the common room, the garden beyond the cloisters had vanished into shadow, the air damp and reflective. The nun's routine persisted, yet the subtle realignments in behavior, posture, and speech suggested that our inquiries had disturbed more than the surface order. Each gesture, each careful evasion, now resonated against the backdrop of the diary, the poem, and the visitor's earlier presence. The lattice of observation seemed increasingly coherent, each element a faint pulse toward understanding. As I walked alone along the stone paths toward the outer gate, the twilight thickening around me, I realized the first threads of clarity had emerged. The interplay of devotion, secrecy, and subtle misdirection had begun to resolve into discernible pattern, a delicate structure of human frailty and intent. Yet even as the outlines emerged, ambiguity lingered, the quiet ache of possibility tempered by the restraint of observation. In Oxford's soft, fading light, the mystery retained its half-shadowed elegance, promising revelation but never rushing its disclosure. Rain had begun again, thin and persistent, tracing silvered paths down the convent windows as Lewis and I returned to St. Hilda's. The air smelled of damp stone and wet foliage, a faint hint of ink and paper lingering from earlier visits. There is a peculiar clarity in rainy weather, a softening of edges that allows small details to assert themselves. I found myself drawn once more to Sister Beatrice's room, the sparse furnishings offering little distraction, yet holding within them traces of intention and concealment. I'd already reviewed her diary and the coded poem several times, each perusal revealing subtleties unnoticed before. Today, my attention fell upon the Bible, its pages worn, the corners slightly curled from habitual handling. In the margin of one leaf, almost invisible unless examined closely, was a faint pencil notation, a brief phrase partially erased and a small arrow pointing toward a hidden envelope tucked behind the binding. Retrieving it, I discovered a letter folded with meticulous care, its handwriting unmistakably Beatrice's. I read it slowly, savouring the rhythm of phrasing, the tension between confession and discretion, devotion and desire. The letter recounted a private encounter with the visitor, their conversation layered with ambiguity. He had inquired about matters of the heart and conscience, subtly probing boundaries while never overtly committing himself. Beatrice's words revealed admiration, caution, and a delicate frustration, her reflections punctuated by lines underlined in a way that suggested coded emphasis. It struck me then that these markings mirrored patterns in the coded poem, reinforcing the sense that intention, not accident, governed her annotations. Lewis, meanwhile, examined the room for practical evidence: the hotel register, a half-drunk cup of tea, the alignment of furniture. His observations were sound, yet it was the interplay of small signals, the slight indentation on the envelope, the faint impression of fingerprints, the underlined phrases, that revealed the faint contours of motive. A minor inconsistency, noted in a previous visit, dismissed at the time, now gained significance. The visitor's precise wording during his arrival seemed to echo the phrasing in the letter, as though rehearsed or at least carefully constrained. I considered the nuns' behaviour, each of their micro-gestures recorded in memory: a glance that lingered too long, a hesitation before speech, the subtle tightening of hands. The letter suggested that Sister Beatrice had been aware of these currents, perceiving loyalties and tensions in ways that only a keen observer could detect. The visitor, her confidences, the coded poem, and the missing diary page now formed a lattice of human interaction, faint but deliberate, a silent architecture of influence and intent. By afternoon, the rain softened to mist, clinging to the cloisters and glistening along the stone paths. I replaced the letter carefully, noting the delicate arrangement of objects, the subtle traces of memory embedded in ink, paper, and gesture. Lewis remarked on the meticulous care of the convent, the quiet efficiency of the nuns. Yet I knew the truth often lies hidden in those very efficiencies, in the controlled gestures, in the deliberate silences that accompany the ritual of daily life. I lingered a moment, the letter folded behind the Bible, the coded poem and diary page aligned in memory, and felt the faint pulse of understanding. The revelation was partial, delicate and persistent, a quiet thread weaving through human intent, secrecy, and the subtleties of devotion. The story of Sister Beatrice, once obscured by absence and omission, was beginning to assert itself, layer by layer, as the lattice of clues gradually converged toward coherence. Dusk had fallen when I walked through the convent garden, the last remnants of daylight glinting on wet leaves, and the air thick with the scent of earth and incense. Lewis had returned to the inn, leaving me alone to trace the paths Sister Beatrice had often taken. The garden, carefully maintained yet wild in small corners, seemed almost to breathe with the memory of human presence. Each footstep echoed faintly on the damp stone, a soft punctuation in the quiet symphony of shadows and dripping water. I found the visitor waiting beneath a gnarled yew, his posture upright, hands folded, yet the tension in his shoulders betrayed restrained agitation. His arrival was unannounced, yet unsurprising. Intuition, I had learned, is often more reliable than schedule. He spoke first, words careful, measured, tinged with the faintest hesitation. He acknowledged my awareness of his prior visits, the letters, the coded messages, and the diary page. There was no overt confession, only the quiet tremor of admission between his lines, a truth glimpsed in phrasing rather than declaration. I observed the minutiae, the way his fingers brushed against the folds of his coat, the subtle shift in weight as he leaned slightly toward a fountain, the micro-expression that flickered and vanished too quickly for Lewis to have noted. These small signals, almost invisible, revealed far more than words. He had been guided by affection, curiosity, and a carefully restrained fear of exposure, his presence intertwined with Sister Beatrice's own disciplined secrecy. He recounted the interactions with her, framing each moment in careful neutrality, yet the inflection betrayed his investment. He had followed protocol and propriety outwardly, but the diary, the letters, the poem, each indicated a tension between what was permitted and what was deeply desired. It was the delicate balance of conscience, devotion, and unspoken longing that had defined their exchanges. I traced the parallels to earlier observations: a rosary bead slightly out of line, the subtle hesitation in a response, the misaligned book page. Each tiny inconsistency now resonated with new significance, a lattice forming beneath the apparent order of convent life. He paused, as if weighing the disclosure of the next thought, and I sensed the quiet pulse of restraint. There is a peculiar honesty in partial confession. It forces the observer to discern nuance, to detect truth between lines rather than within them. I did not press him, allowing the silence to act as interlocutor, letting the unspoken convey more than words ever could. A bird flitted across the garden, the sound of its wings a soft punctuation, and the visitor's expression tightened briefly, an acknowledgement of the fragility inherent in disclosure. We walked slowly along the stone paths, rain softened, the garden's scent of wet earth mingling with the faintest hint of lavender from carefully tended hedges. In the quiet cadence of movement, the confession became a lattice of gestures, glances, and phrasing, each contributing to the slowly emerging pattern of events. By the time he departed, the shadows had thickened, and the air carried the weight of unspoken understanding. As I lingered beneath the yew, observing the last glimmers of daylight on the fountain, I felt the first faint coherence in the lattice of mystery. The diary, the coded poem, the letters, and the visitor's careful disclosures converged in a delicate alignment, revealing the contours of hidden motives, devotion, and human frailty. Yet even as clarity emerged, ambiguity remained, the quiet ache of partial truth echoing among the damp stones and muted foliage of the convent garden. Morning arrived with a pale, hesitant light that filtered through Oxford's mist, draping the city in a gentle, contemplative haze. Lewis and I returned one final time to St. Hilda's, the convent now quieter than ever, as though it had sensed the imminent closure of its subtle drama. The stone corridors, damp and still, seemed almost to exhale, the echoes of past footsteps lingering faintly like half-remembered memories. There is a peculiar solemnity in returning to the scene of events once the lattice of mystery has begun to reveal itself, a mixture of relief and melancholy. I began by revisiting Sister Beatrice's room, allowing my gaze to rest on the sparse furnishings and the carefully arranged personal items, the missing diary page, the coded poem, and the hidden letter. Each had been examined, traced, and interpreted, the small details converging into a coherent narrative. The visitor's presence, once enigmatic and carefully measured, now aligned with the revelations contained in Beatrice's meticulous writings. Motive, timing, and subtle misdirection now formed a delicate architecture, precise yet imbued with human imperfection. Mother Superior received us with composed dignity, her posture relaxed but attentive. The final conversations were quiet, the careful politeness masking an acknowledgement of truths already intuited. The nuns, whose gestures and phrasing had so intrigued me, now moved with a measured calm, the tension of concealment gradually dissipating. Each subtle anomaly I had noted, a misaligned rosary bead, a pause too long before speech, a micro-gesture of hesitation, had found its place in the lattice of understanding, revealing not culpability, but the delicate contours of human emotion and devotion. The visitor arrived once more, as if to offer silent closure. His acknowledgement was brief, unadorned, yet carried a weight of recognition. The diary, the poem, the letter, all had been deciphered with patience, and now the lattice was complete. The confession in the garden, subtle and unspoken, had provided the final connective thread, weaving together the strands of secrecy, affection, and duty. I observed him closely, noting the faint tension in his shoulders, the careful arrangement of his expression, the way he allowed words to linger just long enough to convey meaning without explicit admission. Lewis, as ever, catalogued facts and sequences, but I lingered on the patterns, the small signals, the quiet interplay of intention and gesture. There is a satisfaction in understanding, yet it is rarely triumphant. It is a recognition of subtle harmonies, the quiet resolution of tensions that have long lingered in shadow. The convent itself seemed to exhale in acknowledgement, the corridors, cloisters, and gardens reflecting the faint order restored, yet retaining traces of absence and unspoken longing. I walked slowly along the damp garden paths one last time, observing the interplay of light on stone and leaf. The story of Sister Beatrice, once fragmented and obscure, now lay before me in its elegant complexity, a lattice of motives, secrets and devotion, constructed with care and revealed through patient observation. The visitor's discretion, the nun's careful composure, and the subtle signals hidden in everyday gestures had guided the resolution without spectacle, without melodrama, a truth quietly emerging from the cadence of human behaviour. As I left St. Hilda's, the mist curling around spires and hedges, I felt the familiar ache of reflection, a melancholy tempered by understanding. Oxford's cityscape stretched before me, timeless and inscrutable, and I considered the lattice of human intention that we had unravelled, so delicate yet unmistakable. The case was resolved, yet the quiet tension of lives lived in secrecy, devotion, and subtle longing lingered in my mind, a reminder that truth often arrives softly in the spaces between words and gestures, and in the silence that follows confession.